While we queue up our next speaker, are we good on the Zoom? All right, so Parker's over there on AV working double time behind the scenes to try to coordinate all this. And welcome, Honorable Bob Rae. We can see you on screen here now, and I'm just going to give a couple opening remarks, and really looking forward to this next 30 minutes we have together. So for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with Bob Rae was the former Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995. But his current assignment right now is he's the Canadian ambassador to the UN, and he's calling from New York today. And once again, the Global First Nations Carbon Summit wouldn't be complete without global presence. So welcome, Bob. Bob was the interim leader of the Liberal Party 2011 to 2013. And Bob, I actually saw a legal agreement come by my desk here a few days ago from OKT Law, and I understand that you have some history with OKT Law as well. So Bob has been around Indigenous issues and Indigenous conversations for a long time, and he brings today some thoughts and perspectives from the UN. And so, Bob, my last comment would be that you and I actually have something in common, which I did a little homework on and figured this out, is we both did the Rick Mercer report once in our day. And if you have not seen Bob's Rick Mercer segment about, I don't know, 2012, Bob? Does that sound right?
No, I did two of them. I've actually done a few. The one I think you're probably referring to was maybe 2005, I think, 2005.
Okay. You went fishing with Rick. Yeah, so it's a must-watch. I can't give away the ending. It's probably my favorite Mercer report of all time. Bob, hands down for you for being a good sport. And if you guys know Rick, you'll know that he took advantage of Bob's sense of humor too. So welcome, Ambassador. Thanks for joining us today. And Ambassador and I agreed to just do a little bit of kind of podcast-style conversation here. And Ambassador, I think a place to start would be, what's on the UN's agenda. I'm a small town farm kid from Saskatchewan. I'm still not totally clear what the UN is up to on a day-to-day basis, or even how it fits into my local world. But what's keeping you up at night over there at the UN?
Well, the UN each year around, the yearly schedule starts in September, so now we're at the beginning of another year. The first thing that happens, the opening of the year is 10 days of meetings, officials coming in from all over the world, including our Prime Minister, our Minister of the Environment, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of International Development. They were all with us for the first few days, and that was a very lively time, because you have all kinds of, think of it as sort of like a big conference where you've got a lot of people meeting, and a lot of side meetings, and a lot of conversations, and of course with the technologies that we have done, the people that are coming in by a whole variety of meetings. I think you'd have to say there's probably 5 or 6 big things happening this year, right now. The first is the issue that's being caused by all the other issues, which is a significant global downturn. Lots of signs, indications of serious challenges for the global economy, interest rates going up, demand going down, production going down, trade flatlining, and in some cases diminishing, and that will in itself trigger a whole bunch of other things that will happen to countries that are impacted by a slowdown of the global economy, and we have no idea, more than anybody else does, how bad it's going to get. But we think that it's serious. A lot of people think it's serious. And the check actually points at the number of countries that have very high debts and that are already in rough shape and bad shape. So that's going to be affected. Second big issue, climate change. It's with us very much on the agenda, on the table. We're going to have a big meeting in Sharm El-Sheikh in Egypt at the end of November. That'll be another major focus point, as well as Biodiversity Summit, which is taking place in Montreal, is environment, global various issues. Pandemic is still with us, so pandemic and its impacts, reverberations, how do we share vaccines better, how do we share treatments better, how do we make sure that we're going to face something like this again. And finally, the conflict. The Ukrainian conflict, the most serious, Russia with Ukraine, but it's the conflict and the climate change and the pandemic that have all contributed to the economic crisis. So when you see you're a kid in Saskatchewan, you're not quite sure what we all do or what the impacts will be. I understand that completely, but the fact remains that what happens in the rest of the world has a big impact on Saskatchewan. There will probably be a higher demand for Saskatchewan's agricultural production for wheat, a higher demand for potash, because potash, as you know, makes fertilizer. But there will be also some significant challenges that will arise out of much higher interest rates and what that's doing to people's incomes and people's jobs. So that all these things are interconnected.
So maybe to build off that, Ambassador, I'm thinking about your comments on economy, Ukraine, and in particular energy. I mean, a lot of the room that you're speaking to today, Western Canadians, maybe trying to better understand the implication of the war, where energy's headed, and your thoughts, because you're looking at this from such a macro level, and maybe the conversation you have with other countries that want to buy Canadian things, whether it's energy or food, really. I have no perspective on what it's like at a very high level in senior government.
Well, I think the energy challenges, as I see it, is this, and I'm taking a bit of a personal take, but a personal sort of sentiment. We're roughly 2% of the global economy, a little more than that, but not much. And the global economy is worth about $100 trillion global, U.S. dollars, a year now. We passed the 100 trillion mark in the global economy, GDP. We made a decision as a country back in the 90s that we would join in the international effort to reduce carbon emissions, to put it in its simplest form. We're a big carbon producer. Per capita, we're a relatively large emitter, big distances, cold weather, resource-based economy, all the reason that's the case. And at the same time, we are not a big emitter in absolute terms, because we're such a small population, and so what we do, we could shut off tomorrow, if we were to shut off tomorrow, all of our carbon emissions, stop driving our cars, stop using gas to heat our homes, you go down the list of all things we do. If we were to stop, it would have very, very little impact on the global situation. And that, I think, is something that's really important for Canadians to understand. We're not a big emitter. The reason that is important for us to join in this international effort is I think there's a general agreement, although there's always going to be dissenting voices, to say that carbon emissions stay in the atmosphere for a long time. They have for the last 350 years. As they accumulate, they change the climate. They have the impact of changing the climate. And that's not good, because things get a lot hotter, things get a lot colder, water level rise, ice melts, all the things we know about, droughts, more floods, more violent weather one way or the other. This is not a good thing. We've got to try to reduce the level of emissions. Canada's not a leader in this regard. We sometimes the rhetoric doesn't make you think that we are, but the reality is that other major emitters, particularly the three big blocks, China, Asia, the United States, North America, and Europe, And the rapidly growing emitters are, of course, in Asia. In the rapidly industrialized world, Africa's relative speaking a very small emitter per population, extremely populated. The fact is that unless we have a credible approach to what we're trying to do and how we're doing it, we'll have very little influence over what will happen globally. I think it's also fair to say that there's, I think, a thought which is misplaced and wrong, the idea. I think that the process of dealing with emissions will be just sort of a gradual bending of a curve. But the reality is that we've seen in many other fields is that it's not that easy, it's not that simple. There's a lot of bumps and ups and downs along the way. And I think we're seeing that now. We saw it in 2008 with the financial crisis. We're seeing it again now. And we're seeing a general problem with public opinion. How far can you go to keep people on side if the impact that people feel is simply that prices go up and they have to pay more, so the cost of living becomes much higher, and that tends to make people unhappy. It tends to put pressure on governments and tends to create a very active political situation. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a time when publics around the world are very, very engaged in trying to figure out how to deal with questions of access and questions of price. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, I want to come back to China in a minute, but first, you brought up 2008. It was actually one of the questions I had thought about first. What's different this time is if I think back to the first generation of, we come out of Kyoto, everyone was going to go out and try super hard, reduce their carbon emissions, and then the financial crisis hit, we kind of tabled those ambitions. But it feels different to me today around the active conversations around carbon management and mitigation. And I'm interested from your standpoint, going through that transition, what's different this time?
Well, we're not quite sure how different it's going to be. I think that the full lift pressures are certainly different. I think there's a wider acceptance today than there was 20 years ago, or 12 years ago, that climate change is real. I think increasingly people are feeling that climate change is not a future issue, not a future problem. It's not my grandchildren's problem. It's my problem. We're seeing that by the linkage between dramatic weather events and the production of carbon emissions. Now, what I said we don't really know, I think it's also fair to say that there's a lot of countries that had plans and still have plans to move from coal to natural gas, and from natural gas and coal to renewables. Whatever the combination could be, but to get with the program of reducing emissions, which you can only do by changing how you produce electricity, changing how you drive your cars and trucks. And we're seeing signs of that, right? We're seeing more electric cars, some electric trucks come on the market. We're seeing a change in technology. We're seeing a lot more solar, a lot more wind, a lot more other ways of getting stuff on the grid. So we see the impact we have. But you got to understand, China is still producing a lot of its electricity from coal, and coal is the most carbon inefficient fuel. And so when you say it looks like it feels different. It feels different. It does feel different. But whether that produces the kind of change in numbers that we're always looking for remains to be seen. During the pandemic, we used to hear the talk. A lot of people talked about bending the curve, right? We want to bend the level of incidence of COVID so we can keep our hospitals open. So we can make sure that we're getting ahead of the pandemic. We're beginning to use the same language about emissions, but you got to remember, in Canada, most of the provinces have not been able to reduce their emissions, and that's creating a challenge of credibility for governments to say, well, we say we're making all these decisions, but we have yet to see the level of emissions come down. And don't forget that the emissions go up. They don't just disappear. The emissions have a way of hanging around. That means that we have a cumulative problem that's built up over a long period of time that's creating the challenge that we now have.
Okay, so let's deal with China then head on. As I always call it the elephant in the room in terms of we think about China, India, big populations, big energy consumers. How's the UN sort of manage their way through that to bring China along at a fast enough pace to actually have a material impact?
Well, they signed the treaty. They've been part of the Kyoto process. And the latest version of Kyoto is the Paris Agreement in 2015. And China's part of that. So China has made commitments. There are countries that would see China go even further. We all would. Because China, as a rapidly industrializing country, is now the world's single emitter on an annual basis. It's not the United States, it's not Europe, it's China. And it will be joined by other countries like India, like Indonesia, like other countries with large populations that are moving to be rapidly industrialized. And there are a number, and we're going to see their emissions go up. So our job is to figure out how do we stop the process of their sticking with coal, and how do we keep coal? That's something we're looking at all the time.
Let's shift gears a little bit. We've got a huge constituent dialed in today, listening from across Canada, First Nations communities. We got First Nations leaders in the room here today, and you obviously have lots of background in this space. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, looking over the fence from New York at the Canadian, influencers in this, say, nature-based carbon space. How do First Nations people play in this category? Do you have advice for them as leaders? Yeah.
5 years, I was very heavily involved in the Vatala negotiations and also the negotiations in British Columbia. So between, actually, more like 70, 20 before I took this job on full time. I spent a lot of time in Ontario, British Columbia, and in Northern Saskatchewan, elsewhere, talking to First Nations and helping them, trying to help give them advice, not legal advice, basically, in terms of what were their rights, and how could they influence the development of public policy in Canada. We now have the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canadians are very much involved in negotiating. And that basically says that First Nations require free traditional territories. And that's the law internationally. I also believe that the principles of the law in Canada. I learned in the process of giving advice that as an outsider, you have to be very careful about giving advice. First Nations are going to make up their own minds as to what they want and how they want to do it. I do think that it's not possible today for energy projects or mineral projects or mining projects or other projects to happen without the informed consent of Indigenous people. I don't think it's possible for that to happen legally. I don't think it's possible politically. I don't think it's possible. So it's essential that First Nations know what their rights are and know how they can exercise those rights and appreciate how serious the impact that they can have really is. This is a changed game. This is a changed game now compared to what was before. And it means that First Nations have not only the right to be at the table, but they have a right to decide what will be the pace and what will be the place of development in Canada. They are very much in the driver's seat.
Maybe focus my last question on something I love to ask leaders. And you clearly have a great pedigree of leadership. And this is that advice you'd give your younger self. If you looked in the rearview mirror, your whole political career and the many rooms you've been in, what would you have told yourself, your 20-year-old self?
If I don't have any regrets, I mean, I would say take your time. I mean, I got into things pretty early. I was elected to Parliament when I was very young. I was a fairly driven person, but I think I would have said, you know, some flowers a bit, enjoy. Not that I haven't enjoyed myself, but I'm very blessed with 3 children and my wife and I's grandchildren, so we feel that's become an increasingly important part of our lives. I think the other thing I would say is don't be too sure of yourself. Remember that you can be wrong, you can make mistakes, and you will make mistakes, don't be wrong. And it's very important to remember that. I think when you're younger, you tend to be looking for perfection and you tend to be very judgeful about things that fall short of that. I hope I've learned not to be quite that sure of myself. Or as that is easy, more self-deprecating, if you like, just be easy myself. And always remember the thing that I've learned in my life through good and bad times is the most important thing is love. Love is the most important thing. I've been very lucky to have been loved and to have been able to love, and that's more than anything else. Way more important than this interview.
I think I want to give you the last word on that. Well said. And I want to hang on one thing you did say that I didn't expect to hear at a Carbon Summit is the word love. It just didn't strike me that would find its way in. But Ambassador, thanks for your time today. You know, as an appreciation gift, we wanted to send you this book. I don't know if you can see it in the shot, but it's Indigenomics, drafted by Caroline Hilton, and it's an appreciation for what you did today to give us your time. You're one of the busiest people that I've ever come across. So thanks again.
Spent last week reflecting a lot on the 30th of September, and I still think there's a journey we all have to go on together. It involves telling the truth, but really involves learning how to respect each other, and if I may say so once again, learning how to love each other. And I think is something we keep having to do. It's going to. It's a good journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Ambassador Ray, pardon me. Ambassador Ray, I watched one of his lectures 13 years ago at the University of Regina on a cold evening, and there was a lecture series on, and he was speaking on Indigenous economics, the economic development of First Nations and some of the impediments to that. He's learned, he knows the subject, and my takeaway from that is first of all, I'm optimistic when someone representing Canada, our country, has that kind of experience. That's a great outcome from this, Marty, that you sort of realize that we have somebody on the file that really knows how to get the job done for us and understands all the issues that are in front of us as well. I think as well his comment on China is important. The fact that we like to say that they're the largest emitters, they're not complying. We hear all of the negativity, which is fine. But the fact remains is that they did sign up for Paris. They are part of the agreement, which is very, very important to recognize. That's always encouraging. And remember, you know, there's still 50 million people in China who don't even have electricity yet. So when we think about the development of a society and the development of an economy, certainly I'm always encouraged to hear that. Marty, I'm going to read a letter that we received. We received it earlier, but we just didn't have an opportunity to properly open it up, addressed to you and I. And it's from one of our former prime ministers, the Right Honorable Jean Chrétien. And he goes on to say, Martin and Lionel, I am pleased to address participants and organizers of this inaugural Global First Nations Carbon Summit. As we have seen in recent days, the effects of climate change can be devastating. Our response to climate change is imperative. I commend the efforts of those gathered here today in seeking and developing needed carbon reduction strategies. Canada has emerged as one of the leaders in the clean energy technologies field. This inaugural summit brings together the leaders of the Indigenous business community, the clean energy industry, and leaders of traditional knowledge, taking Canadian success to the next level. I wish you the best in your deliberations and look forward to the outcomes and the recommendations from this summit. The Honourable Jean Chrétien, former Prime Minister of Canada. Well, thank you, Mr. Chrétien, and we appreciate the fact that he's been participating in the First Nations file in a very, very meaningful and significant way throughout most of his political life.